Great to be here with you. If you have a Bible, go ahead and open to the book of Numbers. Numbers chapter 1 is where we're going to be today. And if this is your first time here, if I haven't met you before, my name is Chase. I have the privilege of serving as lead pastor here at the Corners Chapel, and I'm just excited to be here with you today. And what we've said pretty much every week so far this year is that our church is committing to journeying through the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation in a single year. And so we're doing this both by having a custom reading plan that you can follow. If you're looking for a Bible reading plan, you can find one online at thestory23.com. But we're also aligning most of our Sunday messages, almost all of our Sunday messages, with our journey through the Bible. In our 1 year-long series, we're calling it The Story. And this series is divided into several different mini-series that are aligned with the genre of Scripture, right? The 66 books of the Bible are clumped together by different genres as the story unfolds. And so we've been making our way through the first part, the Pentateuch is what it's called, or the books of the law, or what we've been calling the starting five. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible. And if you haven't been with us so far, or you just need a little bit of a refresher, let me just give a quick recap of where we've been so far. Okay, the story of the Bible starts in Genesis, right? But the story of God starts before that, because the first verse of the Bible starts with, "In the beginning, God created," implying that God didn't start at creation, but he was eternally existent before the start of time. Right? That's something we can't fully grasp or wrap our minds around, but it's a necessary framework for coming to the first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created. Right? God always was, he is, and he always will be. He's outside of time. But the book of Genesis tells us that God is the creator, that he created everything that is. He created all of creation, and he created it all. He said it was very good, right? He created it to reflect his goodness and perfection. But that's not what we see when we look out in the world today, is it? No, when we look out in the world today, we see sorrow and suffering and sin and death. And the book of Genesis also gives an account for why everything is the way that it is today. It tells how sin entered the world, and as a result, how death entered the world. And yet at the same time, while we're told how the world fell into chaos and destruction, we're told at the very beginning of the book of Genesis that there would one day come one who would defeat sin and death, and all that is wrong would be made right. In Genesis 3:15, we're told that someone would come that would crush the head of the enemy. Someone would crush the head of the enemy. And so we're tracing that. We're looking for this promised one as we move through the story of Scripture. And so the book of Genesis can be said to be the story of creation and promise. Creation and promise. And we see that in the book of Genesis, the story zooms in on a particular man named Abraham. God promises Abraham that he's going to be a great nation and that one of his descendants will be a blessing to the whole world. He says, I'm going to bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. That's what's known as the Abrahamic covenant. And we saw that in Genesis 12, that promise from Genesis 3:15 passed to Abraham. And we see that promise passes down to his children as his family grows, and the promise is passed down until there's a man named Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel, right? And Jacob has 12 sons, and this promise is passed down to his son. And so we're told that there's going to be a promised king who will crush death, and he's coming from the line of Judah. Okay, there's a promised king coming who will crush death, and he's coming from the line of Judah. That's the book of Genesis in a nutshell. Well, the book of Exodus starts, 400 years pass, and Israel's now multiplied into a great nation, but they're enslaved in Egypt. And so what happens? God raises up a leader named Moses, and Moses frees the people of Israel in dramatic fashion, right? There's the plagues over on the Egyptians, there's the Passover, the parting of the Red Sea as the Israelites walk through on dry land. Just miracles on miracles until the entire nation is brought out of Egypt, and then God gives them instructions or commandments on how they should live morally. It becomes known as the 10 Commandments. And he also tells them to build the tabernacle. the tabernacle. This was the Israelites' temporary place of worship. I've said it was like portable church. They would set up and tear down as they went on their journey through the wilderness. And then at the end of Exodus, we see that God came down and filled the tabernacle. Right? There was a loud noise as God came down from heaven and filled the tabernacle. For a second, I was thinking that's what was going on during Chapel News with that rumbling. But in Exodus 40:34, it says this. It says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting." So this is another name for the tabernacle. "And the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle." So it fills with God's glory. And catch this, verse 35. "And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle." And so we can say that the theme of the book of Exodus is that it tells the story of the deliverance of God's people and the beginning of the instruction that he was going to give to his people, how they were going to be set apart from all the other nations. Now, if we're honest, I think this is where most of us fall off the wagon, right? Like this is where most of us, our Bible reading plans start to collect dust until the next year. And so if that's you, don't feel discouraged, because this is the perfect week to jump back in, because in just a few moments I want to show you why the book of Numbers is really where the story picks back up. But before we get there, we come to the book of Leviticus. How do most people hear when they hear, or how do most people react when they hear Leviticus? Probably a deep, heavy sigh, right? It's kind of dry, is what it seems. Well, no, let's try something. When I say Leviticus, I want you to start cheering. Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3, Leviticus. There we go, right? see, I think if we really understood the theological implications of the book of Leviticus, right, what God was doing here, we realize it's anything but dry. Because this book, the book of Leviticus, that Pastor Valmir did a wonderful job a couple weeks ago unpacking, it's answering the question, how can God dwell with a sinful people? Right, remember at the end of Exodus, we just read the verse, not even Moses could go into the tent with God. Right? But Leviticus, the book that was written to the Levites, the priests, the priestly system, it's talking about the sacrifices. It's saying how God can dwell in the midst of the sinful people. It's outlining how people can have their sins atoned for. And again, Pastor Valmir a couple weeks ago did a great job reminding us about the sacrifices and the Day of Atonement, where once a year the high priest would symbolically transfer the sins of the people onto a lamb and send that lamb out of the camp. And he talked about how all the sacrifices instructed in the book of Leviticus, most notably the Day of Atonement, they foreshadow the ultimate sacrifice that would take place on a cross in the New Testament when Jesus laid down his life for us. And so we can say that the theme of Leviticus is holiness and substitutionary sacrifice. Holiness and substitutionary sacrifice. That's the whole point of the book of Leviticus, that God is holy and that we're not, that we're sinful, and the wages of sin is death. So that means either we need to die or something or someone needs to die in our place. And that's seen in graphic detail as these sacrifices are outlined in the book of Leviticus. But what's amazing is that we see that when the system of Leviticus is operating, that it worked, right? That God can dwell with the sinful people when the Levitical system is in effect. How do we know that? Well, look at the first verse of Leviticus 1. It should be on the screen. It says, Yahweh called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. So this is just how, after God had come down and filled the tabernacle, and God speaks to Moses from inside of the tent of meeting. He starts giving him all of these instructions. They go into effect. And then look at how the book of Numbers starts, the very next book. It says, Yahweh spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting. So now Moses is inside of the tabernacle. He can go in, and the priests can go in and make sacrifices. And so now the people are ready. The Levitical system is in place. It's been a year since the crossing of the Red Sea. And now it's time for them to enter into the promised land. That's the setting for the book of Numbers. They're ready to move into the land, but what we're going to see is that what should have been a relatively easy journey turns into an absolute disaster. And the theme of the book of Numbers really turns out to be disobedience and consequence. And so with that as a lengthy setup to the context of where we're going today, let me give a brief word of prayer, and then I'll tell you the direction I want to go as we look at the book of Numbers this morning. Father, thank you again for the privilege it is to be here to worship you. Lord, I pray that you will speak through me in these moments, that I might become less and you become greater. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So the book of Numbers is really a record of what I like to call the worst road trip of all time. Okay, again, Israel's been sitting at the base of Mount Sinai for a year. Everything since the middle of the book of Exodus, they've been in the same place for a year since they got the 10 Commandments. And so now they're ready to move into the Promised Land on a trip that really should take 2 weeks, maybe 3 if they're moving a little slow. But to move from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land is not that long of a distance. Now, if I say Mount Sinai to the Promised Land, that means absolutely nothing to us, right? And when it comes to distance. So to put it into perspective, I should have a map of our area. Now, whenever we're talking about the Promised Land, we obviously got to make Cleveland the Promised Land. So that's where they're trying to go. And so an accurate depiction of the distance from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land would be Indianapolis. Okay, so Indianapolis is Mount Sinai. That's the wilderness, if you've ever been there. And so this is the journey that they're taking. And so the whole book of Numbers is really they're trying to get from Indianapolis to Cleveland. That's what you can think of. And they're walking. That's the book of Numbers. In our English Bibles, the book of Numbers is called Numbers because the book opens and closes with 2 major censuses or numberings of the people of Israel. But I think Numbers is really an unfortunate name, one, because it's boring, but also because that's just a small portion of the book. The Hebrew name for the book is Bimidbar, which means in the wilderness, which I think is a much better name for the book because the numbers are important, right? All scripture is God-breathed, so the numbers are important. But what brings the book to life are the stories of Israel in the wilderness, their disobedience and God's faithfulness in the midst of it all. And so the first thing I want you to know is this. The book of Numbers is about Israel's road trip, if you will, from Mount Sinai to the edge of the Promised Land. Okay, that's where it fits into the biblical story. Back in 2017, just a few months after Ada was born, Amanda, Ada, and I, we were living in Dallas, Texas. And so my mom flew down to help with our new adventure of parenting. And after spending a few days with us in Dallas, we were all going to drive back up to Ohio. I love road trips, but Amanda, my mom, Ada, who was 3 months old at the time, myself, were road tripping halfway across the United States from Dallas. And we quickly realized this trip was doomed from the start. Okay, first of all, we had to go through Oklahoma, so that's strike one. And if that's not bad enough, it was tornado season, and we got caught in a terrible storm at night. I don't know if it was a tornado because it was night and we couldn't see, but we had to pull into this parking lot for about an hour and seek shelter there. So strike two. Ada was with us, and I love Ada, but being in a small enclosed space for about 2 days with a newborn, there's a lot of strange sounds and smells that you experience against your will, and so strike three. It was really hot. Okay, it was July, and so whether we were getting out to eat or pump gas or whatever it might be, it was miserably hot, unbearably hot, strike four. And if that's not bad enough, we capped it off by running out of gas. And I won't mention who was driving, but I'll just say we ran out of gas. And where we ran out of gas, the closest person we knew was 300 miles away. So strike five. Right? This was a trip that was filled with error. But not only did we grow closer through all of it, but we actually had an incredible experience at the end that really kind of redeemed the whole thing. There was a blessing in the middle of this error-loaded trip. And that was that we had to call the police to come help us out with gas. Now, if you're thinking, how in the world is that a blessing? If anything, that's another strike right there. Well, I don't have time to get into all the details, and this isn't the main point, but we had this incredible experience with this police officer. We called him for gas, and he waited with us for about an hour and a half, and we had an incredible conversation with him about just the racial tension that our nation was facing and is facing, and he told us about his fears and concerns that the police face, and as the sun was setting and the mosquitoes were coming out in the middle of this hot day, we decided to pray together. And so we spent some time praying together. There was an incredible blessing in the middle of this trip that's filled with frustration. I think there's a picture of us praying. We're praying, but I'm taking a selfie that says something about me. But anyway, what does this have to do with the book of Numbers? Well, I think that this trip that we experienced that was filled with hardship, but that there was a blessing at the end of it, this is a perfect picture of the book of Numbers. Because they're on a road trip that goes downhill very, very quickly. But in the middle of that, towards the end, there's this incredible blessing. And so what I want to do with the time that we have left is look at 4 instances on this road trip in the wilderness that were absolutely awful. They were results of disobedience. And then hopefully if we have time, we'll finish with the blessing that we see at the end of the book. This incredible moment that almost redeems the whole thing. Okay, so Numbers, again, starts and ends with Moses numbering the people of Israel as they begin to prepare to enter into the promised land. And so he takes a census of them, and he also tells them the order that they should set up their camp. Numbers 2, verse 1, it says, Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, the people of Israel shall camp each by his own standard with the banners of their father's house. They shall camp facing the tent of meeting on every side. Those who camp on the east side toward the sunrise shall be the standard of the camp of Judah by their companies. And then it lists all the names and numbers. And like I said, these censuses, is that the plural of census? Censi? Whatever. These numberings of the people, they tell the order that the camp was arranged in. And again, that's not the main part of the story, but this is important. In fact, it's remarkable that when you plot out these numbers and the arrangements and where they're told to be located in the camp, any idea what shape it makes? A cross. It should be on the screen in just a second. That's the layout of the camp of Israel that they were told to be in. And we got to move on, but keep this in mind because this is going to come back at the end of the book of Numbers. Okay, so Moses has numbered the people. They're told the arrangement to be in the camp, a cross, and God gives them instructions. And then finally, Numbers chapter 10, they're ready to head out. Numbers chapter 10, verse 11. It says, in the second year, in the second month, on the 20th day of the month, the cloud lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the people of Israel set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai, and the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. They set out for the first time at the command of Yahweh by Moses. Okay, if you're journeying with us through the story, now we are finally out of the weeds. We've been at Mount Sinai getting instruction all the way since they got the 10 Commandments. For us, that was 3 weeks ago, but for them in the story, it's been a year. And so they're finally ready to head out. As a side note, I think that part of the reason Numbers gets a bad rep is simply because I think people don't make it all the way to Numbers chapter 10. Right? The first 9.5 chapters seem just a lot like the book of Leviticus, but you get past that, and finally Israel is ready to depart, and this is where the action starts. Okay, so they're heading out. We have a picture of what it might have looked like as they were leaving the camp. The Levites are first in line carrying the Ark of the Covenant. They were told how to build that in Exodus 25. And so the Levites are leading the charge. The tribe of Judah is at the head right behind them. And this is important. Numbers 10, verse 33. It says, so they set out from the mount of Yahweh, 3 days' journey. And the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh went before them 3 days' journey to seek out a resting place for them. And the cloud of Yahweh was over them by day, whenever they set out from camp. And whenever the ark set out, Moses said, arise, O Yahweh, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you. And when it rested, he said, return, O Yahweh, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel. Okay, so they're leaving the mountain, entering into the promised land, and it says they all lived happily ever after. Now, I wish it said that, but Numbers 11:1. The very next verse, it says, and the people complained in the hearing of Yahweh about their misfortunes. So they made it exactly 0 verses before complaining. And it's even worse because look at what they're complaining about. We didn't talk about this on the Sunday we went through Exodus, but they're grumbling in the wilderness because they're hungry. And so God makes bread fall down out of heaven to feed them. And look at what they say, Numbers 11:4. It says, now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish that we ate in Egypt. That cost us nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at. They're mad because the only thing that they have to eat is the miraculous food that God made fall from heaven. Like, it's ridiculous, and they're ungrateful, and so what does God do? He sends a plague, and the people die. And they finally learned their lesson, right? No. Numbers 12:1. Miriam and Aaron spoke out against Moses. Okay, so now his own brother and his own sister have turned against him. And they spoke at him, they turned on him because of the Cushite woman whom he'd married, for he had married a Cushite woman. That's Numbers 12:1. Cush was a region south of Ethiopia that was known for having dark skin. And so basically they're upset with Moses because he's married to a black African woman. And so the punishment for Moses' frustration, God gives her leprosy. I love what Pastor John Piper says, one of my favorite pastors. I think this is funny. He says, what is most significant about the story is that God does not get angry with Moses. He gets angry at Miriam for criticizing Moses. In God's anger at Miriam, Moses' sister, God says, in effect, you like being light-skinned, Miriam, I'll make you extra light-skinned. And that's what he does by giving her leprosy. And then he quotes Numbers 12:10. He says, when the cloud removed from over the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous like snow. Pastor Tim Brown, a pastor in El Paso, he says almost the same thing. He says, I love how God responds to Miriam's prejudice against Moses' black wife. God turned Miriam's skin white as snow, though through this, God was saying to her, Miriam, if you think that black is wrong, then I'm going to give you extra white skin. And so as a side note, this is one of the strongest stories to use against those who try to say that interracial marriage is unbiblical. The Bible does not condemn interracial marriage, and while I don't think that's a point that I need to convince most of you, this is a clear example of the opposite being true, as Miriam is rebuked and cursed for her opposition to Moses' marriage. And so the people complain, Miriam complains, Aaron complains, and God sends punishments. And so what we need to see is this, on this road trip through the wilderness, immediately the people of Israel fail and fall into this pattern of complaining, and as a result, God sends plagues. Strike one. Okay, the road trip is not starting off well at all. Well, maybe it'll get better in the next chapter when they're standing on the edge of the promised land. And what does God instruct Moses to do? Verse 1 of Numbers 13. Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a chief among them. So Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran according to the command of Yahweh, all of them men who were heads of the people of Israel. So these weren't just 12 random people that were picked. These were 12 leaders of Israel that were sent to go spy out the promised land. And jump down to verse 31. At the end of 40 days, so they've been in there for 40 days spying out the land, they return and they come to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told them, we came to the land to which you sent us, and it flows with milk and honey. This is its fruit. So they're using poetic language to say that it's flowing with milk. In other words, it's a great place for the cattle, and the crops will be great, and it's bountiful and with fruit and all of this. Verse 28. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very long. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell there, the Hittites, the Jebusites. All these people are dwelling in the land. And so they're saying, hey, we know that this place is prosperous. It's a great land, but it's taken. Verse 30. But Caleb, one of the 12 spies, quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are all well and able to overcome it. I love Caleb. We'll talk about this in a couple weeks. Caleb's one of my favorite people in the Bible. But look at how the people responded. Verse 31, then the men who had gone up with him said, no, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. So they brought the people of Israel a bad report. Stop there. Okay, so the spies come back saying, yeah, this isn't going to happen. Bad news, time to go back, we're doomed. And so the people say, or Caleb and Joshua say, don't you remember what happened when God was bringing us out of Egypt? Right, all of those plagues, like God is with us. Let's go take the land. But look at chapter 14, verse 1. I know I'm going quickly through the story here, but I'll tie this together at the end. Chapter 14, verse 1. I'm reading from the New Living Translation here just because it's more conversational. So after this report of the spies, it says, "Then the whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. 'If only we had died in Egypt, or even here in the wilderness,' they complained. 'Why is Yahweh taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt?' Then they plotted among themselves, 'Let us choose a new leader and go back to Egypt.'" It's almost comical, isn't it? It's like a tragic comedy. But Moses and Aaron and Joshua and Caleb, they realized right away there's nothing funny about this at all. All right, verse 5. "Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before the assembly of the congregation of the people of Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, they tore their clothes." Right? They're not saying, "Please listen to us, give us another chance." They're not begging for their jobs. No, they're falling down on their faces saying, "What have you done?" They're saying, "You have evoked the righteous anger of God." And they're right. Because to say that the people is an understatement, or to say that the people are upset is an understatement, because they start trying to kill Jacob and Caleb. They're the two good spies. The people try to stone them. And then we see what I think is one of the most terrifying moments in the whole Bible, really. Numbers 14:10. It says, "Then all the congregation said to stone them with stones. But the glory of Yahweh appeared at the tent of meeting to all the people of Israel." Like God shows up. They're all fighting. If you're a Marvel fan, this is like Thor showing up in Wakanda, right? Aslan showing up in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, whatever illustration you want to use. God shows up in the middle of this battle. But what makes it terrifying is that this time the people of God are on the receiving end of his righteous anger. And by people of God, I don't mean those who trust him, but the nation of Israel, the ones who thought they were just about to get into the promised land. This is the 10th time recorded in Scripture that they've complained, and now God shows up and says, "I'm about to drop the hammer." And Moses, he tries to intercede, but look at what God says, verse 28. "Say to them," this is God speaking, "as long as I live, declares Yahweh, what you have done in my hearing I will do to you. Your dead bodies shall fall in the wilderness, and of all your number listed in the census from 20 years old and up who have grumbled against me, not one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb and Joshua." Verse 31, "But your little ones, who you said would become prey, I will bring them in, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But as for you," one of the most haunting verses in the Bible, "but as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in the wilderness. And your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years and shall suffer for your faithlessness until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness." This is the second moment of disobedience, really the 10th, but that they refuse to trust God. And so as a result, an entire generation is told that they can't enter the land. Only those 20 years and under, except for Joshua and Caleb. Everyone else is going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until the last of them drops in the desert. Why 40 years? 1 year for every day that the spies were in the land and didn't trust God. So strike two. It's not looking good. This is why it's the worst road trip of all time. Well, there's a brief story about them trying to enter into the land. God's not with them, and so a bunch of them get wiped out. The punishment, the prophecy is coming true. And when you think about this, we'll come back to this next week, but based off of the numbers and the census at the beginning of the book, if all of them are going to die, that whole generation, within the 40 years, that means an average of 37,500 people were dying each year. Imagine, on this trip, 100 people, on average, were dying every single day. Everywhere Israel went in the wilderness for 40 years, an average of 100 people were dying every single day. We see a pretty intense picture of death in chapter 16. This is now 26 years later, so it's jumped a little bit. It's 26 years after their disobedience, and we don't have time to work verse by verse through this story, but to summarize, a man named Korah challenges Moses and he gets 250 leaders of Israel. So he's got some influence. He gets 250 people to come to Moses and complain. And they basically say, Moses, why are you the one calling all the shots? Right? Who made you king over us? You know, basically saying, you go into your little tent and say that you hear from God. Like, who gave you that authority? And what happens? Moses falls on his face again immediately. He's like, this is not good. Right? This is not going to end well. And there's some back and forth between them, but ultimately, let me read Numbers 16, verse 28. It says, and Moses said, hereby you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these works, and that this has not been of my own accord. Sounds a lot like what happened in Egypt, right? He says, if these men die as all men die, or if they are visited by the fate of all mankind, in other words, if nothing unusual happens, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates something new, we could spend a lot of time talking about this. We often pray that God does something new. It's not always a good thing when God does something new. He said, if the Lord creates something new, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into Sheol, the grave, then you shall know that these men have despised the Lord. You have to wonder what they were thinking as he's saying this. They don't have a lot of time to think, because verse 31, and as soon as he had finished speaking these words, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, with their households and all the people who belonged to Korah and all their goods. So they all that belonged to them went down alive into Sheol, the grave, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. Strike three. Right, bad things are happening, bad things after bad things, and if you're keeping count, really this is like strike 37. We see that there's another instance of disobedience and consequence. And then one final instance, Numbers 20. You feeling encouraged yet? All right, anyone want to go on this road trip? Now, the encouragement's coming in just a second, but there's one more instance of disobedience, Numbers 20. This is now 38 years after the spies report. So people have been dying for 38 years. They're almost in the clear. 2 more years to go. Well, the chapter opens with the death of Miriam. Right, she caused some trouble at the end, but she really was a major figure. She helped Moses at the start of Exodus, and if we're moving through the story, we should feel the weight of her death. Well, look at what happens next. Verse 2. Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. Surprise, surprise, right? They still haven't learned. 38 years into the consequence, and they're still angry, but this time they want water. I mean, it's a reasonable request, but instead of just asking for guidance and direction and trusting the Lord, they go back to their, why did you bring us out of Egypt? And so God tells Moses to essentially perform a miracle. Moses is supposed to speak to a rock, and the rock will bring water. But this time Moses is fed up. Right? He's been leading the people for 39 years. He's been putting up with their complaining and rumbling and grumbling, and look at what he does in verse 10. It says, then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, you can hear the anger in his voice. He says, hear now, you rebels. Shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. Verse 12, and Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given you. Add this to the list. Another example of disobedience. Moses and Aaron, because of their disobedience, they don't get to enter into the promised land. Think about that for a second. How is that fair? Right after everything that Moses did, after everything that he did for the people, we're told in Exodus that he talked to God like God was his friend. He got to see the glory of God in the burning bush. He was the main instrument that God used to bring the people out of Egypt. He received the 10 Commandments on the mountain, the 10 Commandments that in many ways still form the basis of morality even for our anti-God culture almost 3,500 years later. Right? How is it fair that Moses didn't get to enter into the promised land? When I was doing my ordination exam for the chapel, one of the questions that they asked is if you could change one part of the Bible, what would it be? It's a dangerous question to ask. The right answer probably would have been I wouldn't change anything. But this is the answer I gave. Right? How is this fair that God does not let Moses into the land? And I was quickly reminded by the other ones in the room, well, this is a reminder that leaders are held to a higher standard. And that's true, but it doesn't lessen the sting. And so here we have it. The worst road trip of all time, filled with death, filled with disobedience, and filled with consequence. And the book of Numbers ends the same way it began. Chapter 26, Moses takes another census. Why does he do this? Because all the people in the first one are dead. So he's got to number the people again, and so he gives some final preparations as they enter the land. If you were to outline the book of Numbers, it'll look something like what's on the next slide. And you see why I think the Hebrew name for the book is better, because the numbering of the people, it's important, but it's not the main emphasis on the story. And so we see over and over again that sin leads to consequence. Now, there's many moral lessons that we can pull from these stories, and I think that they're important. God takes sin serious. God's holy. We can even look at the fact that while it might be hard to find, there is some grace in God's judgments, right? Miriam, when she was causing a fuss about Moses' wife, God punished her, but he still let her live for another 38 years. Israel wasn't completely wiped out. The younger generation was preserved and would get to enter the promised land, like we'll see in a couple weeks. The sons of Korah, his sons didn't die, and they went on to become amazing musicians who wrote several of the Psalms in the book of Psalms. Talk about a redemption story there. We didn't even have time to look at the story of the plague of the snakes. If you know that story about the snakes in the wilderness, and God provided a way for those who were bitten to be healed. And so there's hints of grace even in the punishments of God. But where I want to end the story this morning is by focusing on one more story that's found right at the end of this trip of misery. And it's found in Numbers chapter 24. Again, Moses has just found out that he can't enter the land. Aaron has died, Miriam has died, and there's this interesting story where Moses is not even mentioned at all. It's about a wicked prophet named Balaam, who even though he's a wicked prophet, he actually is not a false prophet. He's a wicked prophet, but he's not a false prophet. He prophesies at the command of God. And so what's this story? Well, let me summarize most of it, and then we'll read from it at the end. So you can just sit back and listen like this is your first time hearing the story. So after all of these events that we talked about, leading up to Moses striking the rock in the wilderness, we see in Numbers 22 that there's a king of a place called Moab. This is not a place that's friendly towards Israel. The king of Moab is a guy named Balak. And Balak knows who the Israelites are. And he knows that the Israelites are headed to the promised land, and he knows that he's in the way. And he knows that if God is with them, then they're going to be wiped out. And so he hires this wicked guy named Balaam to curse the Israelites. Well, Balaam, again, he's a wicked guy, but he knows he needs God's permission to curse Israel. And so these are the two main characters in this story here, King Balak and Balaam. And so Balaam goes to God and says, hey, God, can I curse your people? And God's like, no, I'm not going to let you do that. You know, it's kind of like how, you can roast your family member, but if someone else starts saying anything about them, then you say, no, it's not happening. God says, I know I just cursed them for 40 years, but I'm not going to let you do that. And so Balak keeps asking Balaam to curse Israel. And so finally God tells him, he says, all right, you can do it, but you have to say what I make you say. And so Balaam goes, and he goes to the top of this mountain where he can see the camp of Israel, and he tries to curse them. And he opens his mouth, and what happens? Blessings. Blessings start coming out. He's trying to curse them, but God has him bless them. Well, King Balak's like, dude, that's not what I paid you to do. He says, can you go back up and try again? And so Balaam goes back up the mountain, and he tries to curse Israel again, but he can't. He keeps blessing them, and King Balak says, he actually says, it would be better for you just not to talk. But try one more time. And so he goes up, he says, try one third time to curse Israel. And so Balaam goes back up, he makes a bunch of sacrifices, and he tries to curse the people of Israel. And look at what he says, Numbers 24, verse 2. It says, and Balaam lifted up his eyes and saw Israel camping tribe by tribe, and the Spirit of God came on him. All right, think about this for a second, right? What did Israel's camp look like? A cross, right? And so he's up on the top of the mountain. He's trying to curse the people of God, and he sees a cross. And look at what it says, verse 5. He says, how lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your encampments, O Israel, like palm groves that stretch afar, like gardens beyond a river, like aloes that the Lord has planted, like cedar trees beside the waters. Water shall flow from its buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. His king shall be higher than Agag. His kingdom shall be exalted. God brings him out of Egypt and is for him like the horns of the wild ox. He shall eat up the nations, his adversaries, and shall break their bones in pieces and pierce them through their arrows. He crouched, he lay down like a lion and like a lioness. Who will rouse him up? Blessed are those who bless you, and cursed are those who curse you. Sound familiar? Specifically, that last phrase is the same exact thing that God told Abraham. Right, all the way back in Genesis 12, and now this wicked prophet is saying the same thing. And so, of course, Balak is upset. Verse 10, and Balak's anger was kindled against Balaam, and he struck his hands together. That's how you know you're mad. You start clapping. He struck his hands together, and Balak said to Balaam, I called you to curse my enemies, and behold, you have blessed them 3 times. Therefore now flee to your own place. He says, go away. That's strike 3. But Balaam doesn't leave. Because look at verse 17. This should be on the screen. Balaam opens up his mouth again and he says this. He says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab. Stop right there. What's going on? See, this is prophetic language, so it can be easy for us to miss. But God is speaking through this wicked prophet Balaam to deliver a message, a promise that one of Jacob's descendants will be a king. And this king, he says, will crush the head of Moab. The promised one will crush the head of the enemy. In the middle of this story of disobedience and suffering and loss and consequence, we see hope. We see the promise that stretches all the way back to Genesis. It's reestablished. It's like God saying, hey, I know you messed up. I know you can't get your act together. I know you're not listening, but hope is coming. He says a scepter, a king will rise out of Israel, and your enemies will be crushed. And God says, I know you're not going to listen to me. I'm going to use the wicked mouth of a prophet to tell you that my promises still stand, that a king is coming. He says it might not look like it right now. Right? You're bearing 100 people a day. It might not look like you're in a situation where a leader will rise up, where you can enter into the land. It might not look like it when there's the ground opening up and swallowing people. But the king is coming. Brothers and sisters, this is where the book of Numbers as a whole speaks into our life today. Yeah, we can draw moral principles from the individual stories. And Lord willing, one day we'll come back to this wonderful book and see there's so much more that we could unpack. It's so much more than just Numbers. And we'll look at each story closer. But when we look at the book of Numbers as a whole, we see failure. We see disobedience. We see consequence. And we see death. But in the middle of all of that, we see hope. We're reminded that hope is coming. I don't know about you, but when we look at our lives today, when I look at my life today, I often find myself in difficult situations, sometimes like the Israelites, brought on by my own disobedience. Or maybe we find ourselves just in difficult situations, a storm of life, and we don't know how to get out of it. Maybe we can't even turn on the news or scroll through the headlines anymore because all we see is death and destruction and hopelessness, right? There's trains blowing up. There's water being contaminated. There's earthquakes killing thousands and tens of thousands, mass shootings every day. And so we say, we just can't take this anymore. And so, but when we turn off the news, then we're confronted with frustrations in our own life at work or financial situations or our own health situation or the loss of loved ones in our own lives. And this journey, this trip that we're on called life is filled with problem after problem after problem. But what I'm here to tell you today is that there is a blessing in the middle of even a life that's filled with frustration. And that blessing is the same blessing that will come to the Israelites in Numbers, but with one small change. They were told that a scepter will rise in Israel and crush the enemy. But the blessing that I want you to know that we have today is that a scepter has risen out of Israel. Because the king of Israel, the ultimate king of Israel, would show up 1,500 years later as a baby in the manger. He would live a perfect life, a sinless life, and he would still be put to death on the cross. And on that cross, suspended between heaven and earth, he would bear the punishment that you and I deserve, but he wouldn't stay dead. He would ascend up into heaven where he's there preparing a room for you and for me. And one day he's coming back to gather his people and deliver the final crushing blow of the enemy that is death. And he will wipe away every tear from our eyes. And death will be no more. And there will be no more mourning or crying or pain anymore. And a great multitude that no one can number from every nation and tribe and tongue will worship God forever. That's the blessing. That's the prophecy that gives us hope in our lives today. And that's what was promised about in Genesis, repeated here in Numbers. And even though it seemed like death had won, they're told that the king is still coming. As our worship team comes back up to lead us in our final song about the hope that we have, the living hope that is Jesus, I want to close with the lyrics of a different song, a hymn that I recently discovered called "The King is Coming." Maybe you've heard it, maybe not, but here's what it says. It says, "The marketplace is empty, no more traffic in the streets. All the builders' tools are silent, no more time to harvest wheat. Busy housewives cease their labor. In the courtroom, no debate. Work on earth is all suspended as the king comes through the gate." How amazing is that picture? The chorus says, "Oh, the king is coming, the king is coming. I just heard the trumpet sounding, and now his face I see. Oh, the king is coming, the king is coming. Praise God, he's coming for me." Happy faces line the hallways, those whose lives have been redeemed, broken homes that he has mended, from those from prison he has freed. Little children and the aged, hand in hand stand all aglow, who were crippled, broken, ruined, clad in garments white of snow. Oh, the king is coming, the king is coming. I just heard the trumpet sounding, and now his face I see. Oh, the king is coming, the king is coming. Praise God, he's coming for me. And then the last verse says this: imagine this day, that if we're followers of Jesus, we will all get to see. He says, "I can hear the chariots rumble. I can see the marching throng. The flurry of God's trumpet spells the end of sin and wrong. Regal robes are now unfolding. Heaven's grandstands all in place. Heaven's choir now assembled starts to sing Amazing Grace. Oh, the king is coming. The king is coming. I just heard the trumpet sounding, and now his face I see. Oh, the king is coming. The king is coming. Praise God, he's coming for me." One day we'll be able to sing that song together as we enter into the presence of God for all eternity. But for now, let's stand and sing this song about that truth that Jesus is our living hope. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to this week's message. I hope it was a blessing to you. I hope it was an encouragement to you. And my prayer is that the Holy Spirit will just continue to use these words throughout the week to equip you in your walk with Jesus. If you have any more questions about who we are or how you can get plugged in, be sure to go to our website, thecornerschapel.com. We'd love to hear from you. Especially, we'd love to hear how we can pray for you. And if this message was an encouragement to you, I hope that you can share it with someone else and be a blessing to them this week. Also, be sure to hit the subscribe button to see more future sermons and other videos that come out on this channel. And I hope that you have a great week. Be blessed.